Prynhamda, Croeso, welcome everyone. Good afternoon. It's a real privilege to be chairing this session this afternoon on the upcoming Assembly elections in Northern Ireland and their implications for the future. I have a very distinguished panel, Professor Colin Harvey, Professor Katy Hayward, and Dr. Joanne McEvoy to talk about these elections. There are elections which have enormous significance, obviously, for Northern Ireland itself, both in terms of the sort of day-to-day policy-making context in Northern Ireland and the wider constitutional context. But there are also elections that seem to ramify out to UK government policy, to Anglo-Irish relations, and potentially to the wider UK-EU relationship as well. We'll be starting with Colin and then moving to Katy and then going to Joanne. Just very briefly, as a bit of background information, I thought I'd share 4 slides, data slides. I'm very grateful Jack Larner put these slides together, and Luke Nicholas helped to make them a bit prettier, but here they are. So the first of these slides is essentially looking at the distribution of seats after the 2017 Stormont election. And it shows the DUP was the largest party, followed by Sinn Féin, and then quite a drop to the SDLP and to other parties. Since then, if we look at attitudes, of actually going back much longer ago than that 2017 election, looking at long-term trends in the constitutional policy for Northern Ireland, we see that the top option remains staying in the UK, but with devolution, although that line has been trending downwards for some time. The second option now is a United Ireland, which in the last couple of years, indeed since about 2015, seems to have been trending upwards. Next, we have Remain in the UK, but with direct rule, which again, in the last couple of years seems to have been on a downward trend, although it has been at lower levels historically. The next slide is about an identity question, a key identity question about whether people regard themselves as unionists, nationalists, or neither. I think it's very important to emphasize this neither group that has grown in significance since the advent of devolution and is now the largest single group, with unionists as the next and then nationalists as the third group. And then finally, just a chart showing voting intention, first preference vote intention since the 2017 election, which shows a pattern of decline in both the largest parties until relatively recently, when support for Sinn Féin leveled off and has since risen, and then more recently again, DUP support has recovered to some extent. But you do see these two parties that had dominated the electoral landscape, perhaps not being quite as dominant as they had been, at least apparently seeming on a declining trajectory. With that, I will hand over to Professor Colin Harvey, a very distinguished human rights lawyer, eminent and distinguished commentator on human rights around the world, but particularly in the Northern Ireland context. So, Colin.
Thank you, Dan. Pryn Hugh Da, good afternoon. Thank you to the Wales Governance Centre. I just want to commend you to start for all your work. I think to start, I also want to underline that we need much more focus across these islands on what's happening in Wales. So it's great to be part of the seminar today, albeit we're talking about Northern Ireland. I'm also very, very proud that my first lectureship was in the Department of Law University of Wales, Aberystwyth, and I have very, very fond memories indeed of my time there. Today we're focusing on the election to the Northern Ireland Assembly that's happening on the 5th of May. The intention here is to provide a brief overview over three themes: framing, agreements, and the future. And I'm really very much looking forward to hearing from Katy and Joanne, who will expand on some of the themes that are raised here. First then, framing the discussion this afternoon. The framing around this island and these islands and the language is quite conscious and deliberate. We're talking about a British-Irish conflict with European and international dimensions still. And Northern Ireland is where that conflict continues and is fought out. And I want to deliberately frame the discussion this afternoon in that broader context about where Northern Ireland sits in these islands and more broadly. And Northern Ireland itself, as many of you know, is a special arrangement requiring periodic redesigned special arrangements. So if there's a lack of melodrama in my presentation this afternoon, I don't apologize for that. The basic political facts on the ground, in my view, have not altered. And they've not altered certainly to the extent that sometimes wishful thinking predicts. And the wishful part of that merits interrogation in itself, in my view. In other words, those basic facts, what is happening in Northern Ireland and what might happen next is largely to be expected, given the nature of a post-conflict society that has required and still does require bespoke arrangements. And it's on that rather boring note, I then move on to my second theme, which is agreements. Ultimately, all current legal and political mechanisms that operate in Northern Ireland and about Northern Ireland attempt to design and implement systems that are respectful of relationships in this island and these islands, and that includes internal power sharing that we're talking about today, but goes much further beyond that. The Good Friday Agreement, St Andrews Agreement, and even what has emerged in the protocol are about those broader set of relationships. So the Northern Ireland Assembly election on the 5th of May must be seen in that wider context of legal and political agreements. And it is essentially about populating the internal power sharing or consociatial configuration element of that, or the strand one dimensions of the agreement, people will be more familiar with, as you all are aware, widely mooted potential changes in the political balance of party political power, which is featuring very, very heavily in current speculation about the election outcome, with the possibility of a Sinn Féin first minister. So the implications of the election, the Assembly election on the 5th of May, include many of the familiar matters that we are all aware of in terms of populating the existing structures around the executive and the Assembly. But it also now includes a vote to take place on the Assembly around the alignment arrangements of the protocol, which we might want to talk about further, has been the subject of recent debate. In other words, Assembly elections are always significant, but this has particular significance in a post-Brexit context and environment. Therefore, close attention will be being paid, as with the previous slides, on the unionist nationalist balance that emerges. And when I say that, I mean the inter between as well as the intra. There are fascinating debates going on within unionism and within nationalism and between unionism and nationalism. Close attention will also be paid to the pro and anti-protocol dimensions of how the seats line up at the end of this election. and in particular, and links back to what Dan has already said, how the designated others will fare in this election. In the context of a society where consent is a big deal, right? What is being signalled in the assembly election really matters on a number of fronts, which we perhaps can discuss further later on. Third, the future. Exercises in prediction, and I'm going to point you towards very helpful slides that Katy has already developed, and I won't talk about those, but you'll all be very much aware that there is in discussions of Northern Ireland at the moment quite a bit of pessimism around. Some of the language around at the moment is quite problematic. The region is being destabilized in rather predictable ways, but I'd like to say in terms of where this goes next, nowhere close to the levels of the past here, and that is always worth keeping in mind. There is a risk, however, that preceding this election and in the last number of months and years, people are talking themselves into corners and potentially back into violent conflict. I don't want to overplay that, neither do I want to underestimate that. In terms of thinking about politics, just want to make a number of points and reflections. Obviously, you'll all be aware of the DUP, the Democratic Unionist Party, largest unionist party at the moment, disengagement over the protocol and around power sharing. In relation to unionism, however, looking at it in historical perspective, unionism is in a semi-permanent state of heightened anxiety. So in some senses, it's not novel, or the issue itself in relation to unionism viewed in a global context is not unique to Northern Ireland. Historically, look at everything that has happened here since the Anglo-Irish Agreement to place some of the current discussions in perspective. Nationalism, republicanism, Sinn Féin and the SDLP primarily, essentially content for now to operate and manage a jurisdiction that was initially designed around their ethno-national coercion and domination. That in itself is quite something, and sometimes I think in commentary is too often neglected in terms of the implications of that. In terms of where nationalism or republicanism is at, in terms of the broader debates around the union or unity, Irish unity, what we see is a fairly bureaucratic, actually, and managerial language on a united Ireland, with a, again, rather managerial focus on planning and preparation. Now, there's novelty here introduced by Brexit, and there's been a significant enhancement of a shared island, if you like, agenda around all of that. The protocol discussions, the EU and the UK are ongoing, as we all are aware, not assisted, I think, by ongoing threats of UK unilateralism, but capable of resolution with wisdom and good sense, and the international environment may be increasingly conducive to that wisdom and good sense prevailing. Litigation. I'm an academic lawyer, so I can't go through this presentation without mentioning law on key questions is going to continue. It's a feature very much of our power sharing arrangements, litigation about core aspects of the way our system functions. And there'll be significant questions going this year to the Supreme Court on things like, for example, the protocol and legacy issues. Now, there's much talk of post-election negotiations, and a lot of people are talking that issue up at the moment. So whatever view you take on the merits of that, it sounds to some people, perhaps to many people on multiple sides, like changing the power sharing goalposts when the rules don't happen to suit, or even worse. But that will be something to watch in the time ahead, certainly post-election, if the DUP are unwilling to, still unwilling to join the executive in terms of first and deputy first minister. If it happens, if there's a post-election discussion on negotiation, it's unlikely to centre only on making internal power sharing work more effectively, and that is what it will be. If there are negotiations, they will be negotiations around making power sharing work more effectively than it currently is working. but it's highly unlikely that any negotiations will anchor solely around that issue. I think the fundamentals and basics of the Good Friday Agreement won't be undermined. Further clarity on the constitutional question may be requested and may emerge around issues of timeframe and potential parameters of the concurrent referendums on potential constitutional change noted in the agreement, as well as a range of unfinished business from previous agreements. However, I think that the fate of New Decade, New Approach, which many will be aware of, will be in the minds of many who are thinking or insisting or pondering the issue of post-election negotiation. Just in terms of finally on the area that I do a lot of work on, which is on human rights. There's been a long-running extensive discussion in Northern Ireland on a Bill of Rights. The final point I'd like to make is around empirical evidence around what that process reveals. Work that I undertook last year with Ulster University and the Human Rights Consortium suggests a really strong desire in Northern Ireland for socioeconomic change and associated rights-based guarantees. So a question I would raise, rather like debates that are happening around Scotland in terms of pushing on in relation to human rights, is that how might regional power sharing further unlock the potential to match what is clearly growing societal expectations for rather familiar forms of socioeconomic environmental change, or it has and have the limits of the current arrangements being reached? I think the build-up of a pressure around that question is one that can be neglected, but I think it's one worth watching. So just to conclude where I started, in not very dramatic terms, although there are many who are raising and heightening the language around this election, what we see in the Northern Ireland Assembly election are many familiar patterns. The key participants at the far end of it will face very similar choices to the ones that are in the here and now. Participants need to try and manage the institutional architecture in ways that encourage participation in quite deliberately complex and, yes, at times incredibly frustrating arrangements, particularly for those of us who work in the area of equality and human rights and on wider debates of social justice. None of that is helped at the moment, in my view, by one of the more inept and irresponsible UK governments we've seen in a long time, and that's not really assisting anyone in Northern Ireland right now. I think people in Northern Ireland don't really need to be pawns in somebody else's strategic game. We are a fragile post-conflict society. So in the end, post-election, we know all the headlines as this society moves towards the 5th of May. But in my view, post-election, we'll be thinking about a reconfiguration and restatement of a very familiar post-1998, i.e. post-Good Friday Agreement puzzle, perhaps one that will emerge in novel forms, but the fundamentals, in my view, are unlikely to alter in this Assembly election, and the puzzle at the heart of this will remain. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Colin. If I could just ask you one quick question. I recall working on devolution in the early years of this century, and there were one or two projects that got started that were looking at the legal dimension of devolution and anticipated the emergence of litigation, which didn't really emerge at least early on. Gradually some devolution litigation of various kinds built up. But as you say, that there does now seem to be a kind of pattern of using the courts Do you think that has kind of longer term implications? Does that herald a kind of judicialization of politics to any extent? Or
it's a good question, Dan, and I think without a doubt that has been happening in terms of, you know, even down to points like our statutory ministerial code, where key elements of the way the system works, including participating in the key arrangements, are litigated, you know, in terms of ministers in relation to each other. As much as I like law and as much as I teach law, however, that's often a sign of a breakdown of relationships and a breakdown of the operation of politics. And just like the internal power sharing arrangements at the heart of Strand 1, they depend on functioning power sharing political relationships that law can do something to encourage and support, but requires things that go beyond law, in my view. And that's true of all the relationships, whether north, south, and east, west. And I suppose a final point on that would be, I don't need to tell this audience that a lot of people here, many of them in this call, anticipated that Brexit in particular would create enormous friction in terms of the relationships here that aren't the sole reason for some of that, but are part of the reason for that. And, you know, that is playing out as we see before us. And, you know, legally, some of this is going to go to the Supreme Court, and that will be one to watch in terms of the current Supreme Court and, you know, the role that the Supreme Court is increasingly playing in the UK wider context as well, and the debates around its future too.
Diolch, thank you, Colin. Just as we move on to hear from Katy Hayward, can I also just mention to the audience that we'll be using the Q&A function in Zoom. So if you have questions for our speakers, please do put them into the question and answer section. So now, moving on to Katy Hayward, who's a professor of political sociology at Queen's University in Belfast and a senior fellow of UK and a Changing Europe, where she leads on work on the future of Northern Ireland after Brexit. She's carried out a huge amount of research in this area, really a leading voice on the issue, has particular expertise, a long record of research on borders and bordering processes, and has written a recent book on what we know and what we should know about the Irish border. So her expertise on borders has been really at a premium over the last few years, and I don't see that changing. Anyway, Katy, take it away.
Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you for the introduction, and thanks to the Wales Governance Centre for the invitation to participate. It's really a privilege to be on a panel with Colin and Joanne, whose work I admire and respect greatly. I do have some slides to share with you. So I'm just trusting you can see that okay. So essentially I wanted to pick up on one element that Colin was talking about. And I do this in part because I think there's a rush to anticipate a crisis after the election, and a number of political motivations and intentions are all in the mix here, and it could be difficult to see the wood for the trees. So I sort of want to help clarify that. And also because it is a really critical election, and what happens afterwards will be important, as Colin says, for the future of Northern Ireland, and in particular the operation of the Good Friday Belfast Agreement. Oftentimes when we're thinking about the future of the Northern Ireland Assembly Executive after the election, the question of the protocol comes into play. And part of the reason why I wanted to talk this through is to show that the protocol might not necessarily be right at the heart of any discussion around the formation of the new executive. So I just wanted to explain that a wee bit. I have published a short piece elaborating on this on Slugger O'Toole, if you're interested in reading a wee bit more. So just in terms of basics, what's happening after the election, the 90 MLAs, 5 from each constituency will take their seats. And according to the rules and the operation of the assembly, each one designates as either unionist, nationalist or other. The first thing that happens then is that they, on a cross-community vote, elect a presiding officer and deputy speakers. And then we come to the critical moment, which is the nomination of the first and deputy first ministers, which is, to all intents and purposes, a joint office. Now, this is where it begins to get tricky. Usually what we say, if you look at the Northern Ireland Act, it's quite clear that the first minister should be nominated by the largest party, the largest political designation. However, there is an exception to this, and that is when the largest party, i.e. that which has the most number of seats, is not from the largest political designation. In that instance, it's the largest party in terms of seats who nominates the first minister. It should be noted that this was a change that was made in the St Andrews Agreement in 2006, apparently at the behest of the DUP. So in that instance, the largest party nominates the first minister, and then we have the largest party of the largest political designation nominating the deputy first minister. Then after that process has happened, we come to the allocation of ministerial positions. This is by de Hont, which is complicated, but essentially it's in order to create that mandatory coalition of the Northern Ireland Assembly. This is why we have at the moment, for example, 5 parties in the Northern Ireland Executive. So as I say in the title there, I think there are 4 most likely scenarios in the formation of the Northern Ireland Executive. And so what I have got here is trying to set them out as simply as possible. So the first scenario is one in which we've had since 2003, where you have the DUP as the largest party, holding the most number of seats, and then unionism holding being the designation that holds the most number of seats. So this has been the case, as I say, with the DUP there since 2003. It's not so likely this time, mainly because of what happened in the 2017 election, in which we saw unionists no longer had the absolute majority of seats in the Assembly, and also because of the polling that we've seen for the last number of months with respect to the support for the DUP, which is significantly lower than that of Sinn Féin. So if we have this scenario, what does that mean for the formation of the executive? So the focus I would anticipate would be immediately on the protocol, because the DUP has made the protocol very much at the forefront of its campaign in this election, and because all the unionist parties have said that they want to see the protocol reformed. Some unionist parties are much more strong on this than others. We would imagine that this would be taken to be seen as a pretty strong message from the Northern Ireland electorate that the protocol is a concern, and this would be taken then back to the EU level. So the formation of the executive in some ways goes out of the hands of the parties concerned. It sort of rises up to the UK-EU level. And we know from reports and what we've heard around how the UK government might manage that, we could expect this to be pretty tense at that UK-EU level. The second scenario is one in which the DUP takes the largest number of seats and nationalism is the largest political designation. Again, this is not the most likely scenario for reasons I've already mentioned. Nationalism in this case would possibly be the largest political designation because the UUP and the traditional unionist voice would have possibly lost out, people rallying to support the DUP, thus enabling nationalism to have the largest number of seats. In this situation, the difficulties in formation of the executive would be in part because both sides would be emboldened. For the DUP, anti-protocol, pro-union, nationalist parties, pro-protocol, pro-Irish unity. So you have the fundamental challenge there of forming an executive between those groups. And this is not unusual in Northern Ireland, but what is unusual is the fact that the pressure really is on then the British-Irish relationship. And especially this will be pressurized if we have a situation in which the British government is interpreting this result as being one of criticism of the protocol, and the Irish government does not see it in that light at all. A third scenario in which Sinn Féin takes the largest number of seats and nationalism is the largest political designation, is pretty much clear. It would mean some form of crisis in some way for unionism. Does it react with realism? DUP, presumably as the largest party of the other designation, would be had the opportunity to nominate the Deputy First Minister. It has not made any commitment that it would do so in such a scenario. The question is, would it be realistic and see the position of Deputy First Minister as one of equality that's able to achieve its objectives to some degree, or would it be loath to join in such a power sharing arrangement? This would again be a real challenge in the formation of the executive. And then the final scenario, and possibly the one that's most likely at the moment, judging by polling, although there's an awful long way to go yet, is Sinn Féin being the largest party, and then unionism being the largest political designation. This in and of itself would potentially mean the deepest challenge for power sharing and deepest pressure on the Good Friday Agreement, because you have different elements from all those other three scenarios of coming into play. You have the issue of the protocol, you have the challenge of the DP being willing to be Deputy First or the Deputy First Minister position. You have the ambitions and expectations associated with Sinn Féin itself as a party holding that First Minister's position. And then you have this also potential sense in some quarters of what unionism as the largest political designation means. So you see here, there are different scenarios. They can be interpreted differently, but I do want to sort of stress that that interpretation is key, and how the different parties respond to these different scenarios obviously brings its own challenges. Fundamentally, though, it doesn't necessarily mean the protocol is the be-all and end-all. So when I'm talking about the formation of the executive, and this is just my last slide now, what does that mean? So as you may be aware, the New Decade, New Approach agreement that Colin mentioned did change the rules as to what should happen where you have an election and followed by difficulties in appointing the First Minister and Deputy First Minister. So the Ministers' Elections and Petitions of Concern Act, which was passed just in the nick of time, means that there is now a 6-month period for the parties to work these things out. So rather than rushing to another election. And at the same time, the ministers from the previous executive will continue on in position. So that the presumption was, when that was formed, that it would offer stability for Northern Ireland, would avoid political crisis, would avoid indeed the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland or the British government getting too involved in these internal Northern Ireland matters. But we have an unusual situation because, of course, the executive wasn't properly functioning as the Assembly came to its conclusion. Because the First Minister had resigned at the beginning of February, saying essentially that the DP would not go back into power sharing as long as the protocol remains unaddressed, as long as the Irish sea border is there. So what we have is a sort of an executive that would be limping along. It wouldn't be able to make new decisions. However, business could continue in the Assembly to some degree. However, there is some ambiguity over what sort of decisions could be made by the Assembly and the degree to which ministers themselves could make decisions And we've seen just before the Assembly was prorogued there quite how much disagreement there was between parties as to the scope of ministers in making such decisions. Amongst all of this, we'll have potentially 6 months of more uncertainty, and the risk is here, almost aside from intentions, that you could actually make what people fear most become a reality. So people's concerns around the protocol across the board in some ways relate to the impact on political stability and the disruptions being caused in light of that. And also, of course, growing concerns around potential economic difficulties. It's very difficult to imagine a situation in which prolonged and tense and somewhat fraught discussions in the formation of the executive could do anything other than harm to people's sense of stability and to the economy in Northern Ireland. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Katy. In terms of the of attitudes to the protocol, clearly this is a touchstone issue for many involved in politics on the unionist side. I know you've done research on sort of attitudes to the protocol. How do they play out in other contexts in Northern Ireland?
Yeah, so broadly speaking, so I was on a radio program earlier in which the head of the Orange Order was saying that unionists are angry at the protocol and unionists feel this about the protocol and that. And that's not quite true, because if you look at the polling data, and indeed, if you talk to unionists, there is a spectrum of views. What is clear is that hardline unionists, those who are DUP supporters, are very strongly anti-protocol and very critical of it. And they want something to be done about it, and they do see this election as a critical time in relation to that. But that is not across the board of unionism by any means. And again, there is a risk of thinking of the protocol issue as a green-orange issue, and it isn't, because of the diversity of views amongst unionists, and also because those who are neither green nor orange, whom you mentioned earlier, are also, I wouldn't say they're pro-protocol, but they're more inclined to be pro-protocol. And this very much reflects the significance of the Leave-Remain divide, for want of a better term, rather than the green-orange divide in contemporary Northern Ireland politics.
Okay, thanks so much. We'll move on now to hear from Dr. Joanne McEvoy, who's a senior lecturer at the University of Aberdeen and specialises in research on divided societies, post-conflict power sharing and peace building, has done research on Northern Ireland, also on Bosnia and Herzegovina and North Macedonia and Iraq. Currently working on 3 research projects that explore the diversity of voices on constitutional change in Northern Ireland and in the Republic of Ireland post-Brexit. Very much looking forward to hearing her analysis of the election in the context of this post-conflict society. Joanne.
Thank you very much, Dan, and thank you to the Wales Governance Centre for the invitation. And it's lovely to be on the panel with Colin and Katy. And I'll probably be picking up on some of the ideas and comments that Colin and Katy have already made, and perhaps we can pick up on these points in the discussion and in answer to the audience questions. So my comments really are about what's been happening in Northern Ireland politics in recent years and months leading up to the elections on the 5th of May, and to speak about, I suppose, the predictions, what we should look out for in the run-up to the elections, and clearly, obviously, in the days in which the count comes through as we await the results of PR single transferable vote, which is the electoral system used. So firstly, to address the idea that's been circulating in Northern Ireland media that this election is a very significant election for the future of Northern Ireland politics and for the future of power sharing. It's a pivotal election, and that the election may well reshape the political landscape in Northern Ireland. And that argument really is centred on this question about who, as Colin and Katy have both mentioned, who is likely to take the post of First Minister. And the polling in recent years and months suggesting that Sinn Féin may well become the largest party. It's important, I think, probably to say a couple of things about that. That some suggest that this is Sinn Féin's election to lose, in the sense that Sinn Féin may well become the largest party, but that's not because of any particular surge for support for Sinn Féin, but more a decline in support for the DUP. And also it's important to acknowledge too that there is some expectation that both the DUP and Sinn Féin may well lose a couple of seats. So we have to keep an eye on a couple of key constituencies. And of course, then that brings into question the importance of transfers through the PRSTV that they'll be hoping to pick up seats. So just on the question of the First Minister role, Katy mentioned the change to the institutional rules by which the largest party is allocated or has the opportunity to nominate the First Minister. So originally in the Good Friday Agreement, we had a cross-community vote. So the largest party of the largest designation took First Minister, and the largest party of second largest designation took the Deputy First Minister role. And that was changed as an outcome of the St Andrews Agreement in 2006, which was essentially about getting Sinn Féin and the DUP to agree to share power. If you remember, there was a fairly long period of suspension of the institutions from 2002, leading up to the St Andrews Agreement, and thereafter the entering into a new power sharing administration with the DUP as First Minister and Ian Paisley, joined by Martin McGuinness as Deputy First Minister. Now, there is a lot of kerfuffle and drama over who is likely to take that post. And for other parties, that's considerably frustrating in that these two positions are indeed equal. As I heard a media commentator put it, Michelle O'Neill's powers before the election as Deputy First Minister will be no different should she be in the position as First Minister after the election. Nevertheless, we can't underplay the importance of the symbolism here. Katy mentioned as well in 2017 Assembly elections, there was no longer a unionist majority in the Assembly. So should unionists not be able to take the First Minister position, and should there not be a unionist majority in the Assembly, that may well prove to be a challenge for unionism. Other parties feel increasingly frustrated by all this discussion about First Minister, given that these two posts are indeed equal, is particularly important and frustrating for the SDLP, for example. So as well on the inter-block competition between, or inter-party competition between Sinn Féin and the DUP, whatever happens after the elections, we just need to keep in mind as well that Sinn Féin and the DUP need one another. That what we have in Northern Ireland is a mandatory coalition, in the sense that there needs to be a nationalist and unionist coalition government, and that executive is formed via d'Hondt. Now, there have been some arguments that for change towards a more voluntary coalition, some parties would be in favour of that, but there is no likelihood in the foreseeable future of moving to such a voluntary coalition. So in that sense, Sinn Féin and DUP need one another. So whatever happens after the elections, it might well be the gravitational pull of devolution to make power sharing work that makes a new executive happen. So within the blocks, or within the two main communities, things have shifted a little bit as well. Within the nationalist bloc then, between Sinn Féin and the SDLP, what we've seen in recent years, well, going back to 2001, when Sinn Féin eclipsed the SDLP as the largest nationalist party. So if you remember, the Good Friday Agreement was essentially secured by the moderate middle of the parties in Northern Ireland, the SDLP and the Ulster Unionists, and they were both then eclipsed by their more, in inverted commas, extreme parties. So Sinn Féin became the largest and the dominant party, nationalist party, since 2001. And within that context, the competition between the SDLP and Sinn Féin has shifted. There is some expectation that SDLP may well struggle in this election, and struggle to find a position relative to Sinn Féin, but also trying to pick up transfers and compete with the so-called moderate middle, including Alliance. Some will also ask, to what extent is the constitutional question important for the competition between nationalist parties? And it's been interesting in the past, even days and weeks, of seeing a little bit of a shift in that Sinn Féin has been quite relatively quiet on the issue of Irish unity. And that's not to say that should the party secure the First Minister position, there wouldn't be, let's say, a spring in their step to then push for a border poll in the short to medium term. But there has been a little bit of a pullback in acknowledging that, as some other parties say, for example, the leader of Alliance, Naomi Long, so that people don't wake up in the middle of the night and think about the constitutional questions. People wake up and think about the cost of living crisis and so on. So there has been a bit of a shift, I think, on the part of Sinn Féin, not to move away from the constitutional question, the idea of Irish unity, which is, of course, their primary political project and objective, but at least to rein back a little and to talk more in very moderate terms about shared space, shared future, and also questions of bread and butter issues and the cost of living crisis. And then within unionism, Katy's already talked about unionism as a whole, there being over the protocol, but also over, I think, an approach to power sharing. So the DUP competing with the TUV, or the traditional unionist voice, or it might be a better place to say the TUV, the traditional unionist voice, a much smaller political party with only one MLA seat. Jim Allister as the leader is nevertheless very vocal and very critical of the DUP position. So Allister's position is a much more vocal, a stronger position on the protocol. So much remains to be seen then, of course, after the elections on how the different unionist parties will manage the outworkings of the protocol and the desire to reform it and to revise it. Much then depends on whether Sinn Féin or the DUP take the First Minister position. So even though many will say that it looks like the Sinn Féin may well take the First Minister position, there's also a view that it could be very close and come down to the wire, and that DUP might in fact be able to secure that position depending on transfers. So really, in terms of what happens after the election, Katy pointed out to 4 potential scenarios. I suppose I'd like to say something about the nature of post-conflict power sharing, which is what I mostly write about, and I'm interested in the dynamics and incentives of post-conflict power sharing, incentivize or encouraging political elites representing different groups to cooperate and get on with the business of governing. Now that we've seen plenty of examples in the past and the experience of Northern Ireland, which has been affected by political stalemates and instability and suspension. And from time to time, these episodes of crisis and stalemate then bring to bear a period of talks of renegotiation, bringing in the British and Irish government. So it won't be a totally new scenario by which we enter into a period of negotiation and inter-party talks. As Katy mentioned too, I think it depends on how long that progresses. Usually, on average, these kind of crisis talks last for 10, 12 weeks or so, a very intense period of talks. But 6 months of talks to form an executive might be pushing people's willingness. So in terms of, nevertheless, the structures of power sharing, what's likely to happen, I think, is that once we know which party will take the First Minister position, we could have potential outcomes in terms of if the DUP can't take that position, then things could well be more difficult. If they do take that position, it will be a get back to work call. So that's really my comments on what's going on with the two main blocks. And I just want to add as well to say that we need to keep an eye and watch out for what's happening within the moderate middle, or so-called the middle ground, which has been growing in Northern Ireland. So the Neither group that Dan mentioned at the beginning. And that is a group that has been growing or sprouting in recent years up to about 20% of the population in Northern Ireland. It will be interesting to see whether Alliance, who is expected to pick up seats, will be able to pick up a ministry through the mechanism of the Hunt. Alliance have been in government in the past by picking up the Ministry for Justice, which is a controversial and delicate, sensitive ministry in Northern Ireland that requires support of the different parties. But this time round, we can keep an eye on whether or not Alliance will be able to pick up its own ministry through the Hunt, depending on its share of the vote or its number of seats. And an interesting question then, I think, arises for should Alliance then become a governing party through the Hunt, what effect that will have on the operation of the executive, even should they pick up maybe more than one. So there's lots to look for in terms of the competition between Sinn Féin and the DUP over the post of First Minister, and lots to look for in terms of what's going on within the respective blocks, what's going to happen within the unionism between the DUP, the UUP and the TUV, and then what will happen in relation to Alliance and the prospect of Alliance picking up a ministerial seat through the Hunt. And that's all from me. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Joanne. That was really fascinating stuff. Perhaps I could push you just a little bit more on that final point about keeping track of what's happening with the moderate middle. We've had one question about the unlikely scenario where other becomes the second largest designation, but I think that your point about picking up a ministry, I think, is more likely, and brings the question of how having a ministry acquired through the Hunt system would change that balance. Do you see that as something that would be challenging for the other two blocks? Do you think there are other ministries than Justice that would be kind of high on the list of things that the Alliance would want to take on if they were in that position?
Yeah. So I think it depends if Alliance has enough votes or enough seats rather to pick up a ministry through the Hunt. It will be interesting to see the effect of that inclusion of Alliance of the moderate middle in the kind of DeHunt formed executive, so the core executive. And that's important, you know, for the protocol that's been mentioned, but I think it's important as well for this kind of wider constitutional question. You know, on the one hand, the unionist concern to promote the union, of course, and on the other hand, a nationalist concern to push forward discussion about constitutional change in the future. And where people in the middle, it is unclear, let's say, where people in the moderate middle or the middle ground, where they sit in relation to those two ends of the spectrum on the constitutional question. So it could well be that Alliance would perform a role to say, look, a plague on both your houses, that people want to look after their families, focus on public policy, we want to focus on the bread and butter issues and not on the constitutional question. And also, I think, to push parties, for example, Sinn Féin in its pursuit of Irish unity, to consider the importance of that middle ground in greater depth or to a larger extent that has been done hitherto. So the challenge is not just for a nationalist to reach out to unionists in their ambitions for constitutional change, but also to consider those in the moderate middle, what their aspirations are, if any, with regard to the Constitution and what their priorities are. So I think it could really have an interesting effect or balancing effect between the two poles in a future executive.
Thank you. Could I invite Colin and Katy to rejoin us virtually? So we've had a question earlier on about the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, and then linked to one that's come up in the question and answer as well. And the question is really about, given the what seems to be a kind of relative weakening of the position of both Sinn Féin and the DUP, so of the leading parties on each of those blocks, does that raise questions about the fitness for purpose of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement? Does it raise questions about whether that might need to be reformed or reviewed? And if it does, you know, how might that challenging process be addressed? Does anyone want to have a first go at that?
Maybe if I just initially share some reflections.
Thank you.
My presentation really was based on acute consciousness of some of the language that's going around, but to slightly downplay some of the discussion around the election outcome. In that there is a long history of this conceptualization of a moderate middle, and I'm putting a question mark over that conceptualization of, because I sort of really quite persuaded by the Brendan O'Leary sort of analysis that essentially, you know, voting communities haven't essentially moved very significantly, but political parties have entered that space, if you know what I mean. So let's see how the election goes, yeah, and let's see how it pans out. Will the DUP actually do better than anticipated? Same with Sinn Féin. Like, my view was, and is really essentially, that although the Sinn Féin First Minister issue, I'm not in any way trying to underplay the sense that that will be historic in some senses. I'm sort of slightly underplaying some of it, because I think the two largest parties will remain Sinn Féin and the DUP in terms of some of the problems that we face. I raise really serious questions about whether now is the moment to be raising the issue of renegotiating the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, this society is rather destabilized right now around issues around the protocol. So there's always been a live debate since 1998 about how the principle of power sharing can be applied more effectively. And as you know, the agreement, the Northern Ireland Act, there's been St Andrews, things have been tweaked and changed, whatever. And I think the framing of the discussion is not a fundamental renegotiation of the agreement, because I think the foundations will remain, but how those principles are applied better and more effectively in 2022. And the issue I suppose I raised at the end is that growing appetite there is in this society for the sort of changes you've seen in Wales and Scotland, and people have seen in the south of Ireland as well, and the pressure that builds up around that. And if there are ways in the longer term of thinking about making the agreement work in the way it was intended to work, then, but I would question anybody raising a fundamental reopening of the agreement right now, because I really don't think that's what we need. I'll maybe say something slightly provocative. I really have a profound concern about the issue of the suggestion that a major political party will really not respect the democratic outcome of an election, and that not really being called what it is. I don't think Sinn Féin emerging as the largest party in Northern Ireland is a justification for not taking the Deputy First Minister role. You will know SDP and Sinn Féin have been quite happy to do that for many, many years. So I would just caution against, the sort of, because we're seeing that sort of problematic, let me name it, sort of anti-democratic language beyond Northern Ireland. And I just think we need to problematize some of that. We need less drama. I don't want to use the dreaded phrase de-dramatize, but we probably need a bit of that.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to come in on that?
Sorry, Katy, do you want to go?
Sorry, I couldn't find my unmute. Just very briefly, I just want to issue a plug for the Northern Ireland Life and Times survey. So we'll be doing a launch of that exactly a month today on the 26th of May, and on our political attitudes modules for that. And we ask questions on reform of the Good Friday Agreement and the operation of the Assembly. Well, yeah, not so much the GFA, but the way that the Assembly functions and the formation of the executive. And the results from that are really interesting and possibly not what you might expect. So I'm just going to tantalize you with that and say there's, but it's very obvious that people are engaged in these questions of the degree to which these rules for power sharing and the way the Assembly needs to function are appropriate or mirror the concerns of the contemporary society.
I would just add, to what Colin was saying, that it wouldn't be terribly helpful to open up any idea of renegotiation of the 98 agreement. And just to say as well that what we've seen since 98, well, certainly since St Andrews Agreement of 2006, is a series of kind of post-agreement agreements, where it's really about tinkering of the institutional rules and addressing some of the bigger kind of legacy issues, to do the kind of wicked or thorny issues of flags and parades and victims and so on. But in terms of the architecture, the institutional architecture, it's been a question of tinkering rather than wholesale change, rather than moving too far away from any of the fundamentals of the 98 agreement. So I wouldn't expect anything other than perhaps another bit of tinkering with a view to making power sharing more efficient, and to incentivize again the parties to cooperate. And much depends on political will and interpersonal relations among those in power.
Thank you. We've had a question from Giada Lagana, thanking you for your contributions. and asking about the position of the Irish government towards the elections, and whether there are any indications about how the Irish government might orient itself to the four scenarios that that Katy set out and that we've been discussing. Katy, do you want to?
Yeah, thanks, Shada, for your question. So I think so I have engaged with Irish officials on this, and I'm very conscious of the sensitivities around it, and in particular, the fact that because the British-Irish relationship is not good at the moment, and because communication isn't great, that it adds particular difficulties, and most particularly that that the Irish government is obviously very much aware of the need to protect the operation, and if you like, the spirit as well as the letter of the Good Friday Belfast Agreement. And it's in a very unusual situation, given that what the Irish government does, how it responds to the outcome of the election is of course very much related now to the EU. And because of that protocols I mentioned, because of the UK-EU relationship, it adds this new layer of complexity that it would never have had to consider before. So in a funny way, it's strengthened in that way, given that it doesn't stand alone. Obviously, the US government has been very clear that any tinkering with, in a negative way, or dismantling of the 1998 agreement would meet with a clear and direct response and challenge. So that helps too. But nevertheless, when it comes to the previous ways in which difficulties, as we've experienced before, have been managed, that's always been about the British-Irish relationship, and the fact that there is such caution and many known unknowns in that, it really does add an extra element of concern, I think, around how that might all be handled.
Thanks. Does anyone else want to come in on that?
I suppose, can I just very briefly, one point would be, just to really follow on from that, that I suspect there's likely to be a very strong focus on implementation of existing agreements and discussion and negotiation around that, mainly because the extent to which, as you know, really the US and the EU have hardwired the Good Friday Agreement into the protocol, and in relation to the current US administration in terms of discussions with the UK government. And I think that's likely to frame what happens next. Just a political sort of reflection might be, the dynamics will be interesting in relation to the Irish government, and if there is a Sinn Féin First Minister, given that the Irish government is in electoral competition with Sinn Féin in the south and losing out at present in that competition, according to polls, how an Irish government will react to that situation, and whether it offers a moment for an Irish government to rethink its relationship with that entire constituency here, and its approach. And I just put that out there as a question, whether if a First Minister emerges, Sinn Féin First Minister, whether there's an opportunity there for the Irish state and current Irish government to rethink its engagement really with that broad nationalist Republican community in Northern Ireland. Would be interesting.
Yeah, that's a fascinating possibility. We have a question in the chat about the ability of the Assembly to resolve under the 2022 Act to prevent any extensions to the executive formation period by a cross-community vote. Can the panelists imagine any appetite for this among members of the Legislative Assembly after the election, Conor McCormack, who's asked the question, says, it seems unlikely to me, but would be interested in your thoughts, perhaps whether it could be viewed as a useful political tool for forcing other parties to clarify their terms, reasons for entering the executive or for not entering it against the clock.
It's a really good point, but the challenge is on unionism. So it's very, very difficult to imagine the criteria being met for such a cross-community vote, given the proportion that would be needed from those who designate as unionist.
So unlikely to come up then. We have a question about the protocol in the context of the majority vote of the electorate to withhold consent to Brexit itself, and asking, is there then a legitimate issue of cross-community consent as regards the protocol?
That's a biggie. Do you want a legal interpretation of that?
Well, just it's really just following on from the discussion we're having. One of the advantages of adjudication and lawyers in courtrooms sometimes is that they can clarify and provide answers to questions that are relatively definitive. And these questions have been, as many of people in this call, Katy know, and Conor, who asked the previous question, know, have been tortuously explored in courtrooms, High Court here, Court of Appeal and beyond. And, you know, have been clarified, and a judicial view has been set down in relation to the arrangements that are there. And my sense is, you know, that's broadly right and established. The protocol has this voting mechanism at the end of 2024 that was recognised at the time, very much a response to concerns that were being raised, I understand, at the time by the British government and actually unions around issues of consent. So there is a mechanism there that accommodates that. There is a cross-community component to that in relation to the time extension element of it, but you know, it is there already. There is a consent mechanism around the protocol, which makes this election intriguing and fascinating in terms of the numbers, where that is based on, you know, a majority vote outcome. I'll just tag on to that a worry that I would have around consent and its multiple meanings. I think what's happening in the conversation here is that the principle of consent in the agreement is getting very muddled with a range of different meanings of consent. And I suppose the worry reflected in your question is that maybe not a worry, but just a question to put out there, is that unionist political parties are increasingly enveloping the term consent as unionist consent to almost everything, including the large constitutional question. But it's quite clear at the moment that that's not how the legal framework operates, and that's been confirmed in courts. And I think that gets it right in terms of balancing the various interests at play, which in some senses makes it, you know, all to play for unionist political parties if the protocol is of such fundamental concern to, let's see, the outcome of the election on the 5th of May.
Thanks. Does anyone else want to come in on that? If not, we've come to the end of the time that we'd allocated for this fascinating discussion. It's been a real privilege to, excuse me, to hear you all on these delicate and sensitive and important developments. As one of my interests is in social policy and the welfare state, so I'm also fascinated by these kind of bread and butter issues that keep coming up. The the issues around the cost of living, also fascinating issues around, the role of the NHS in Northern Ireland and so on. I've been doing a bit of work on comparative welfare states recently, and since 1980, the United Kingdom is one of the countries that's seen the sharpest fall off in the generosity of welfare provision, and Ireland, by contrast, has seen a considerable rise, although not in the area of something like the NHS. And I just remember, before all the Brexit issues kicked off, there were questions about bedroom taxes, which were taken in a very different way in Scotland and Northern Ireland to the direction of the government in London. What I'm really trying to say is that once we get to the point of this election having happened, once we get past the executive formation process, maybe we could have you all back to talk about how things have played out and what that means for the future, and particularly for a future that includes these critical issues about, ways of living, standards of living, what happens to nurses in Northern Ireland and, across both islands. Actually, I think there are going to be challenges in all of those kinds of areas. I'd be really thrilled if we could tempt you back at a later stage to think about the outcome of this process and what it means in those broader terms. But for now, I'd just like to thank you for your fascinating contributions to this really important and easily misunderstood set of questions. Easily misunderstood, I'm sure, where you, Colin, and Katy are based, but also often not well understood on this island either. So diolch yn fawr, thank you for your contributions this afternoon. And thank you to our audience for your fascinating questions.